Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for the invitation. Today I'm going to present joint work with Gianluca, which is called Some Like It Hot, Inclusive Monetary Policy under Okun's Hypothesis. Okay. So let me start by saying what is Okun's conjecture, right? So we have like this old paper by Okun from 1973, where he conjectured that a high-pressure economy, where he's thinking an economy that is running a low level of unemployment, has the potential to persistently improve the economic condition of less advantaged workers, allowing them to find steady employment, build up their skills, and climb the job ladder. In the paper, Okun is also recognizing that running this high-pressure economy has potential costs in terms of inflation, right? And has this really nice quote where he says that the sacrifice of upward mobility brought down by running a high-pressure economy must be carefully reckoned as one of the high costs of accepting slack as an insurance against inflation. So why do we think that this is interesting? We think that this is extremely interesting because it seems to be reflected on the change in the Fed's framework that occurred over 2020. In particular, with respect to the employment mandate. So the Fed in 2020 changes the employment mandate to recognize that the maximum employment should be a both broad-based and inclusive goal, okay? And it did so by recognizing that running the economy hot might bring benefits to low-income communities. Now, what does that mean in practice? Let me give you just some motivation by looking at how the Fed behaved over the past two recessions, okay? So here I have a figure. On the top, we have inflation year over year, and the vertical dashed blue lines indicate the point at which the Fed start climbing rate following the two past recessions. So we go back to 2016, where the Fed was still operating under the previous regime. And we see that around 2016, first month almost, as soon as inflation starts to pick up, it's still below 2%, but it starts to pick up, the Fed initially starts raising nominal rates. It does by so little at the beginning, and then at a more aggressive rate. And if you look at inflation behavior following that, it seems to be very successful at obtaining a stable level of inflation around 2%. If you move now to unemployment, unemployment seems to be going down following the Great Recession and a very accelerated speed. When the Fed kind of raises the nominal rate, that unemployment still kind of decreases. It does so whenever unemployment is around 5%. But if you kind of squint your eyes, you can see that the level of, or the speed at which unemployment decreases seems to have decelerated a little bit. Now we move on. Now we move on, fast forward to 2022, where the Fed is already operating under the new regime. And we see that the Fed only starts raising nominal rates at the first months of 2022, where inflation is already running almost at 8% per year. Okay? The consequence of that on the labor market is that that recovery that started following the COVID recession seems to be prolonged, and you get unemployment falling at a very high speed. And whenever the Fed's kind of raising rates, unemployment is already below 4%. So that is the sense in which we think that the Fed is internalizing or has changed its attitude by recognizing that running the economy hot might be beneficial, especially to some specific demographic groups of people. So what is that we do in this paper? We are motivated by this shift in policy, which seems to have embraced some of that Okun's hypothesis. And what we are going to do is we build a quantitative Hank model with three-state labor market models. So there's going to be workers that are employed, workers that are unemployed, and workers that are out of the labor force. And we try to include several mechanisms that we think that give rise to this Okun hypothesis that we can test it. We are going to calibrate the model to the US economy, and we are going to use that to simulate some counterfactuals under more inclusive monetary policy rules. We are going to use those simulations of counterfactuals to then access what is the trade-off between inflation and both aggregate and distributional labor market outcomes. What is that we find? What is that we find, at least so far? Okay, I have to say that these are all very preliminary results. First rule that we are going to try as inclusive is exactly the average inflation targeting. And what we find is the average inflation target does not look like an inclusive policy in the sense that it doesn't seem able to run a high-pressure economy. And as we kind of working on it, we're realizing that any symmetric rule, and that's the way that we implement the average inflation targeting, is not going to be able to run an economy persistently hot over a long business cycle. So to the extent that average inflation targeting does promote some force to keep rates, real rates lower for longer following recessions, you have the same force that would keep real rates higher for longer following high inflation. What we do find that seems like a rule that could potentially run the economy hot or run a high-pressure economy in the sense of Okun is an asymmetric policy rule. In particular, a rule that is more accommodative during expansions and reacts more aggressively during recessions. And that rule can generate at the cost of 2 to 3 percentage points of additional inflation on average, at least on our current calibration exercises, effects over the labor market. So on average, we are obtaining that average unemployment falls by 0.5 percentage point, and the participation increases by 0.5 percentage point. And again, in align with the Okun's conjecture, the effect seems to be larger at the bottom of the skill distribution. So the effects at the 10th percentile of the skill distribution is that participation to increase by almost 2 percentage points, while labor income increases by 6%. Because the effects are larger at the bottom than at the top, we also get the effect that this alternative rule reduces earnings inequality, here measured as the P90 to 10 ratio, by over 5 percentage points. Okay? Now, before I go into the model, Okun is writing this paper back in the 70s, and from the 70s to today, we have somewhat accumulated a lot of empirical evidence of the mechanism that he's kind of conjecturing whenever I cited that code, right? And I want to go through, before I go through the paper, 3 of the mechanisms that we think are important and that we'll try to include in the paper. The first one, you kind of have heard yesterday again and again and again, is the fact that workers are unevenly affected by recessions, okay? So yesterday, in the presentation of Alice Dair, we kind of talked about these incidence functions where some workers' labor earnings are more affected by recessions than others. I'm going to do that over the unemployment space, okay? So what we have here is the level of unemployment for workers of different skill level. We can think of those as basically wages during different points of the business cycle. So pick the blue line, which would be kind of the unemployment rate during an expansion. Unemployment rate for workers of high skill is low, around 2.5 percentage points, while the unemployment rate of workers at the bottom end of the skill distribution runs at almost 8%. Now, over the business cycle, this unemployment is going to go up, say, during a recession for all workers of the skill level, but workers at the bottom seem to be disproportionately affected by that, with their unemployment rate going from 7 to almost 15%, while workers at the top see their unemployment raising by 2.5 to 5%. So here, a monetary policy rule that keeps this high-pressure economy is especially beneficial to the low-income groups, okay? Now, it's not only operating through that, the fact that workers at the bottom end are more susceptible to unemployment. We do know today that there's a large evidence that unemployment tends to have very large and persistent effects. So a second channel that we think is important is through this human capital accumulation. Workers' earnings tend to grow while they are employed, and workers do lose earnings upon displacement that are very large, persistent, and higher during recessions. So here we have a plot from Davis von Wachter showing exactly comparing the path of earnings from workers who get displaced versus workers who do not get displaced during expansions and recessions. So you can look at either graph for the first point is earnings kind of upon displacement fall by 20 to 30%, and you can see that those effects are very persistent. So even 5 to 10 years after displacement, these workers relative to workers who did not lose their jobs is still somewhat 10% below. So again, a monetary policy that runs a high-pressure economy can either raise the level of human capital by keeping these people in employment, or at least limit the loss by avoiding that these people lose their jobs. And finally, the last mechanism that we want to consider is what Robjin and Sain call the participation cycle. So here we have a figure of participation over from 1980 until 2019. The actual participation is plotted by the black line. It's kind of hard to see the shaded areas, but if you squint your eyes, you can kind of see that over some periods of recessions here, participation tends to fall a little bit. So around 89, around 2001, and during the Great Recession. But now looking at actual participation and trying to identify the cyclical moves is kind of hard because there are other confounding factors, long-term trends like female forced participation and aging of the population. What these guys are going to argue is that if you isolate the participation movements that comes from flows between employed and unemployed, you actually get the participation is pretty cyclical. And that is the red line in the bottom. And that tends to fall on every single recession over that period and tends to recover over every single expansion. That's maybe seeming a little bit counterintuitive at first, right? How it can be that a flow that is not crossing the participation margin affects the level of participation? After all, these people are still moving between employed and unemployed, so they're still participating. And the reason why it does is that the attachment of these two groups of people to the labor market is very different. So the unconditional rate at which unemployed workers drop out of the labor market, so the U to N flows, is an order of magnitude higher than the rate at which employed workers drop out of the labor market, the E to N flows. So again, a high-pressure economy that sustains employment and avoid these people from losing their job is going to potentially have an effect by sustaining the labor force participation. With that said, let me then jump through some details of the model. Okay? So workers are going to be heterogeneous on skill. That's going to be, for us, similar to what Adrian and Alistair was presenting today, the idiosyncratic income risk. Okay? But we think of skill as both capturing observable characteristics as well as unobservable characteristics that affect workers' labor market outcomes and earnings. Workers can be in one of 5 labor market states, which we denote by S. Okay? So workers can be employed, they can be unemployed and ineligible for unemployment insurance, that is U0, or they can be unemployed, eligible for unemployment insurance, that is U1. And there's going to be 2 states relative to a non-participant. We have what we call a passive non-participant and an active non-participant. And these are going to be different along the margin that the passive non-participant is not going to be receiving any job offers and is not going to be actively choosing whether or not they participate. So this is just one state where we force people out of participation. They have to sit on that participation until they're hit back to an active non-participant. And the reason why we do that is that in the model, the active choice to participate or not is going to be made solely on the level of wealth and on your productivity. But in the data, we think that there are other dimensions through which people may decide to leave the labor market that we are not capturing them out. So think of you leave the labor market in order to take care of a relative, because of childbirth, because of a health shock. So these are all modeled throughout this transition to the passive non-participant. Now, there are going to be transitions among all the states, some endogenous, some exogenous. So there are going to be exogenous job separation rates, so transitions from employment to unemployment, exogenous unemployment to employment transitions, job finding rates, and also with a lower rate, some job finding rate out of non-participation. And we are going to make those all a function of the skew Z. So if you remember yesterday Gaston's presentation, he was exactly showing us some evidence that the separation rates tend to vary across people in different quintiles. That's exactly what we are going to allow here. There's going to be this exogenous switch in and out of passive non-participation, the state N is 0. And there's going to be an endogenous participation choice from workers that are on the active non-participant state. They may choose to join the unemployment pool, and from the participation state back to the active non-participation. Now, how is that your skills are going to evolve? Your skills are going to evolve depending on your employment status. So there's going to be some reversion to the mean captured by the parameter theta and some volatility captured by sigma z. If you are employed, your skills are going to tend to appreciate and go up by a rate delta Z plus. If you're unemployed, or out of employment, I should say, your skills tend to depreciate. They go down by a certain rate delta Z minus. Okay? So workers who are currently employed, they observe their skills depreciate. And again, because their frictions that they face depend on their Z level, they see their prospects in the labor market to deteriorate. Okay? So this is going to create this slippery slope experience in the labor market. That whenever you get fired, your skills tend to go down, so your earnings upon replacement are going to be lower, but also your prospects in the labor market tend to deteriorate. So it's going to be harder for you to find a job. Whenever you find a job, there's going to be a less secure job, which is more likely to throw you back to unemployment. Okay? So utility is going to be log consumption. Individuals pay a fixed cost of participating that is different whether you're employed and unemployed. And there is this utility cost associated with hours worked for the employed. What about the budget constraint? We can write the budget constraint depending on the state of the labor market that you are. If you're employed, you're consuming. You're saving here on a mutual fund, much like what at least that you had yesterday. You have some return RT on those savings. You receive some lump sum transfer from the government of IT, and you receive labor earnings that are proportional to your skill level Z and the number of hours worked HT. Okay? And those get taxed by some certain fraction. If you are unemployed but eligible for unemployment insurance, your budget constraint looks pretty much the same, but instead of receiving wages from firms, you're receiving some unemployment insurance that depends on your skill level. If you're on one of the either states, either ineligible or out of participation, the only income that you receive is basically this lump sum transfer from the government. Now, we don't allow people to save, so they face this borrowing constraint. They must hold like a positive level of liquid assets. What are the choices the individuals are going to be making? As any heterogeneous agent setting, individuals are going to be continuously choosing between consumption and saving, correct? But here they also have to make this participation choice, right? If I'm employed, do I want to keep working? If I am non-participation, do I want to join the unemployment pool? So that combines, here is just the language in continuous time, combines this optimal control problem with our optimal stopping time problem. So how these things usually look like, a problem with the fixed cost is just going to split the state space of the household or the worker into two regions. One region where you participate, a region where you don't participate. So here we have the state space for an employed worker, which is level of savings and says log productivity. There is a threshold, here denoted by the EN. Workers who fall to the right of that threshold decide to participate. Workers who fall to the left decide to leave the labor force. So participation is actually going to be more likely whenever you are productive. So you do want to work whenever you have high returns on working, or whenever you're poor. So that extra income that you get from labor earnings is actually more valuable because of marginality of consumption. Workers who kind of fall close to the threshold may hit the threshold either because they save themselves out and they accumulated enough so they feel comfortable sitting back home, or they may get hit by a negative productivity shock, which point they decide to drop out of the labor force. Alternatively, they may also get hit with that passive non-participation shock. They are forced out of participation. What about the remaining model ingredients? That is going to be looking very similar to what Adrian presented yesterday, what Alistair presented yesterday as well, and not by coincidence, mostly because I learned from reading you guys. So there is going to be a monopolistic producer with flexible prices and a linear technology. Okay, so output is just equal to the total input of labor, which here combines hours worked by the employed workers. There's going to be a labor union that sets wages subject to quadratic adjustment costs. So in a representative agent world, you think of ERSAG. In a heterogeneous agent world, think of the work of Adrian, Ludwig, and Rogley. And as Alistair was presenting yesterday, we are going to use the marginal rate of substitution in that union problem of a standing representative agent. So in his case, it was kind of using the representative agent of all workers. We are taking a standing representative agent representing the employed workers. Okay? So that is going to basically determine wage inflation as a function of the marginal rate of substitution and the real wages. Now, because firms are basically going to charge a markup over the marginal cost, and because of linear production function, their marginal cost is just nominal wages, that wage rigidity gets transferred to price rigidity, and we have that price inflation is equal to wage inflation. Okay? So I said that household wealth is just shares on this mutual fund. The mutual fund itself has some instruments that it can invest. It's either going to invest on government bonds or on firms' equity. So the markup generates a source of profits here for firms. Now, regarding labor market frictions, we could do two things here. We could do as Mario did yesterday, which is to set up a matching function, having firms posting up vacancies in order to meet up with workers, having workers searching to the other side. Because of the heterogeneity that we want to include in terms of the Z, we're going to be doing something different. So at steady state, we're just thinking of these frictions as exogenous. And we are going to calibrate to match the average flows, and we are going to calibrate the dependency on Z as we get from the data. Now, out of steady state, I want those frictions to react to level economic activity, and I'll just make them a function of average hours worked per work. Okay? So to the extent that there is a demand shock that pushes up the demand for labor, workers are going to be required to work additional hours. That's immediately going to affect the level of frictions to bring more people into employment. We have a government. It's going to issue that. Taxes depends on transfers. And a monetary authority that sets a nominal rate based on central policy rule. Okay? What are the sources of aggregate fluctuations that we are playing around at this stage? We are thinking of having one demand and one supply shock. The demand shock is a wedge to the Euler equation, while the supply shock is just a wedge to that wage-Phillips curve. So before I go to the exercise, let me just talk you through a little bit how the labor market looks through the lens of the model. And in terms of calibration, this is still somewhat preliminary, but I would say we are doing a somewhat reasonable job. So by picking up the level of frictions and some of the preference parameters, we are able to get close to the flow rates, okay? And in particular, observe that we do match the fact that I was referring to, that the exit rate of unemployment seems to be an order of magnitude than an exit rate out of employment. We also do reasonably well at matching the stock level across the skill distribution, which we do not directly match. So we have the solid lines are in the data, so the low skills tend to have higher unemployment rate and lower participation rates. The dotted lines are the model, and we do seem to capture the point at which these things go up. Okay? Now, I told you a lot about the mechanism through which we think that Okun's hypothesis might be operating. How is that we include those to the model? Okay? So the first, the uneven instance of business cycles, we are going to be including mainly through those skew-dependent transition rates. Okay? So here we're back to the data. I want you to think look at the blue line as the level of the job loss probability and the level of job finding probability across the skill distribution at steady state. Okay? So, of course.
Say a little more about the stochastic process for ZT?
I can. Let me see if I need to go back. There's no problem. So ZT is basically IAR1 in continuous time, right? So it has some reversion to the mean captured by theta, and it has some volatility, so dW is just like a Brownian motion that gets affected by lambda z. Now that mean, which you're reverting to, depends on whether you're employed or unemployed. So you have a positive, we are writing in terms of drift, you have like a positive drift whenever you're employed. So for most of the state space, your skills are kind of growing up, and you have a negative drift whenever you're unemployed. So if you're out of a job, for most of the space, there is some randomness occurring. For the most of the state space, you just tend to go down. Okay. So I was saying like the unevenness. So yesterday we saw, at least they're kind of introducing that as unevenness through that incidence function that mapped your idiosyncratic productivity IT to a level of labor earnings. We're going to do that through the frictions. And I was calling attention, say, to the blue line, which tells a little bit how we calibrate those frictions at steady state. So on the left, we have the job separation rate for different levels of skill. On the right, we have the job finding rate for different levels of skills. And what I call attention is that the labor market experience for, say, someone with the average level of 1 seems to be very different than a low level of skills. So it's not only the case that low skilled workers have a much lower job finding probability, they also feature a much higher job destruction rate. So again, it's that idea. It's harder for them to find a job. Whenever you do find a job, they tend to lose that job more frequently. Now, over the business cycle, here we have how these transition rates are changing in the data. They seem to be moving mostly proportionally. And that's the assumption we're going to have in the model. In the model, they're going to move with respect to hours, but we're going to make it so that they move proportionally along the skill distribution. The rates are moving proportionally, but the impact on the unemployment, as I'm going to show you, is going to be disproportional. In particular, we're going to capture the fact that unemployment rate of workers at the bottom of the skill distribution is going to be more sensitive to shocks than the unemployment rate of workers at the high end of the skill distribution. Now, one thing is that not only workers are going to be unevenly exposed to the business cycle, that exposure is going to propagate through time exactly through these persistent effects from job losses. So on the left, I have the same figure that I showed you before. It's kind of the empirical evidence that average earnings of people who end up losing their jobs tends to fall by 20 to 40% on the year of displacement. It's very persistent. On the right, I have that replicated experiment in the model. And you can see that we get close to the same amount of earnings reductions upon displacement. We don't get as many following 5 or 10 years, but it's still quite substantial. So the blue line is kind of the experiment done at steady state. Still the case that 5 to 6 years after, earnings for the group of individuals who lose their job is almost 10% below, and it's higher upon, say, a negative demand shock. Okay? And it's higher upon negative demand shock because, again, their job finding probability upon losing their job upon a negative demand shock is smaller, so these people tend to spend more time unemployed, which through that skill process is going to depreciate their level of skills further and further. Finally, the third mechanism, which we call the participation cycle. So what we have here is the participation response to a negative demand shock in the blue. We see that participation is strongly pro-cyclical, falls upon the negative demand shock. But I want to think how much of that movements in participation are coming from the movements between employment and unemployment, right? How much of that is coming from the fact that the employed face a higher attachment to the labor force. So in orange, what we do is that we draw what participation would have been had we changed only people from employment and unemployment while keeping fixed the inflow and outflow rates out of participation. So once we do that, you see that participation is basically not moving at impact because we're just shifting people from employment to unemployment. But the fact that that unemployment pool kind of grows during recessions puts downward pressure on participation because their overall outflow rate's higher than those that are employed. And that's comparing like the blue and the orange, you see that a large fraction of the movement participation is coming exactly through that channel. So when we put all those things together, right, and we look at what is the labor market outcomes to a negative demand shock at different points of the distribution, what is that we get? So here I'm plotting the unemployment rate, the participation, and labor earnings at the 25th percentile of the skill distribution versus the 75th percentile of the skill distribution. It's not only the case that unemployment rate goes up by more at the low end of the skill distribution, goes up by 25 percentage points relative to 10 percentage points. Participation rates falls by 15 percentage points versus 0.5 percentage points. But it's also the case that labor earnings not only fall by more, it's falling almost by double, they're also more persistent. And again, it's also more persistent because they are triggering in the other mechanisms, right? So people are going to stay long. There's a larger fraction of people losing their job, but they're going to stay longer period unemployed, which depreciate their skills. So while on the 75 percentile, kind of takes around 20 months to recover half of the losses on earnings, that is taking almost 60 months over 25th percentile. All right. So with that, let me use the remaining time that I have to go through the counterfactual policy experiments. So we are going to focus on the period from 1990 to 2019. And our baseline simulation is going to assume that the Fed has followed a standard inflation targeting from that period. Okay? With the RFs we have from the model, we are going to then invert the model to obtain a path for demand and supply shocks that perfectly match the unemployment and inflation rate during that period. So we are basically going to replicate in the model the unemployment rate from 1990 to 2020, as well as the price inflation. And then we are going to ask, how would the US labor market and inflation dynamics had been had the Fed followed a different monetary policy rule over that period? In particular, had the Fed followed a more inclusive rule. And the way we're going to do that is exactly using those filter shock, assuming that monetary policy was operating on inflation targeting, and feeding in under alternative monetary policy rules. So what are those rules? Our baseline rule is that the Fed's basically follow inflation targeting with a standard reaction to inflation of 1.5 and a reaction to deviations of output from steady state of 0.05. Okay? We are going to look at two alternative inclusive rules. One of them is going to be average inflation targeting, which is basically the same reaction plus an additional consideration to past average inflation, which here I'm denoting as gamma pi t. That is just a geometric average of past inflation. Here we're taking the rate to consider an average of the past, say, 4 years, so the past 48 months. I'm also going to look what I'm calling an asymmetric rule that is basically having different reactions to positive versus negative deviations of output. So here we want to consider a rule that is more accommodative during expansions and reacts more aggressively during recessions. So we are choosing an extreme case where it's basically not reacting to positive deviations on output gap and has double the reaction to negative deviations to a negative output gap. So when we do that, what is that we get? So let me first focus on unemployment on the right-hand side. And let me first compare, say, the blue line, which is the one generated from inflation targeting, which again matches by construction the unemployment rate, versus the orange line, which is the AIT. So here, by the symmetry of AIT, I already kind of mentioned that you shouldn't get any persistent effects, so this series doesn't have any different than average, but it could still look very different in terms of their volatilities. What we are finding, though, is that while AIT seems to dampen the responses to demand shocks, it does amplify responses to supply shocks. At net, through the kind of filtered demand and supply shocks that we're getting, we end up getting that AIT has very similar implications, at least in terms of quantities, as inflation targeting. It does generate, though, a less volatile inflation rate on the bottom. Okay? Now, what does the asymmetric rule does? It does, as you would expect, it prevents unemployment from going to up during recessions and allows unemployment to fall by more during expansions. So the green line is not going to kind of fall always below the blue line over the recession. What we see on unemployment rate translates to participation as well as to output. And on average, we have that unemployment is running 0.5 percentage points below, while participation is running 0.5 points above. The counterpart of that is exactly higher inflation. So we do see that inflation is on average 3 percentage points above what you would get on the blue line following averaging, following the regular inflation target. Okay, so this is the impact on aggregate outcomes. What about the distributional ones? So here I'm plotting the unemployment rate at the 25th percentile on the left, unemployment rate at the 75th percentile on the right. So first, independently of the monetary policy rule that's being followed, you kind of see that these workers at the bottom end of distribution have a much more cyclical experience of the labor market than workers at the top. So their level of unemployment is fluctuating to a larger extent than workers at the top. That is what Emerson kind of called this worker beta experience, right? Now, in terms of the rules itself, it seems that the asymmetric is benefiting both workers at the top and the bottom. The magnitudes of the difference are somewhat larger at the bottom than they are at the top. And that does translate not only to the labor market outcomes, but also to their consumption. And consumption, the gap between the blue and the green lines is higher for the average consumption on the 25th percentile than the 75th percentile. Another way of seeing those impacts over the distribution is to look at some inequality measures. We think of two. We look at the 75 to 25 percentile ratio for labor earnings, as well for consumption. So first observation is that these things seem to grow up every single point in the recession, at every single recession episode of this period. AIT, again, is not doing much in terms of the results. The asymmetric rule is preventing inequality to go up by much, and is reducing inequality by more during expansions. Now, going back to that Okun recognition of the trade-off, he kind of mentioned, right, that the sacrifice of upward mobility must be carefully reckoned with a high cost of accepting slack insurance as an insurance policy against inflation. I showed you the results of simulation for one particular asymmetric rule. What you could think of doing is varying those coefficients on inclusive rule and trace out this trade-off, okay? So the more asymmetric I get, more inflation I'm going to get from that rule, but potentially a higher benefit in terms of the labor market outcomes. So that's exactly what I'm plotting over the bottom in terms of the unemployment rate, participation, and labor earnings. And these are all normalized so that more to the right means larger gains, okay? The red line shows the impact on the average of those variables. So that's why I was kind of mentioning that for 3 percentage points higher inflation, you kind of get a 0.5 percentage point reduction on average unemployment, 0.5% reduction in participation, and a 1% increase in labor earnings. But as the shaded region shows, and that is exactly the impacts on the P10 versus P90 of the skew distribution, the distribution effects are also very large. So the gains in unemployment for the P10 are almost 3 times as large as the gain on the average, same participation, same in the labor earnings. And you can go from almost go back to inflation targeting, or you can consider potentially even more asymmetric rules, okay? With that, let me conclude by saying that today I showed you that monetary policy can, in principle, run a high-pressure economy that improves the labor market prospects of low-skilled workers at the cost of high inflation. What do we think are interesting things going forward? Again, inspired by the work that we saw yesterday, we want to do the comparison to fiscal policy. So potentially, do we also want to think on asymmetric fiscal rules? Okay. Second, right now, we are observing that these rules induce larger inflation, but it's not clear first what is this cost of average higher inflation in the model, and second, this cost as it is kind of getting equally distributed to households. And we know from this recent episode of inflation that who ends up bearing the cost of inflation might depend heavily on many factors, right? Now, there are potentially many channels for which individuals are differentially affected by inflation. One we think that is interesting is, and relates to what Elisa presented yesterday, is exactly that the compensation of individuals along the wage distribution seems to be very different. In particular, the compensation of individuals at the high ends of the the wage distribution is much more dependent on profits and bonuses than at the low end. To the extent these bonuses and profits can potentially react more flexible to the level of economic activity than, say, someone that is earning the minimum wage at the bottom, they could potentially have differential effects for inflation amount. Okay? With that, let me say thanks, and let me pass the mic to our